Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Helen Geiger, one of the assistants in this arguments series. Today I'm here to introduce Amale Andraos, who's here in her capacity as co-author of the book 49 Cities. So Amale Andraos is a co-founder of the Work Architecture Company, a New York City-based firm developing architectural and urban planning projects that engage issues of culture and consciousness, nature and artifice, surrealism and pragmatism. Recent projects by Work AC include the winning competition entry for a new cultural centre on New Holland Island in St. Petersburg in Russia, a museum extension for the Blaffer Museum in Houston, a branch library for Kew Gardens Hills in Queens, and the first edible schoolyard, New York City, which was put together with the assistance of chef Alice Waters. Amale Andraos received her B.Arch from McGill University in Montreal and her M.Arch from Harvard University Graduate School of Design. She's a full-time assistant professor here at Columbia in the GSAPP and has taught at numerous institutions including Princeton, Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Parsons School of Design, New York Institute of Technology, and also the American Institute in Beirut. So please welcome Amale.
Thank you, Helen. Well, it's great to be back, although I'm happy not to be here. I think this might be, I know you've just discussed the project, but I hopefully will kind of put it under a slightly different light for all of you in terms of the process and the thinking behind it rather than just a kind of product. I think it's probably interesting for you because there's a kind of, I believe, a sort of freshness to the approach, whereas it's not a kind of end of an argument or a conclusion, but rather it was really a sort of beginning for us to just kind of declare that we would do this project without necessarily a very clear idea of where it would lead, and a number of years later realizing that it certainly influenced a lot of our thinking and practice and kind of set some kind of project to our practice. So, sometimes just launching, having the kind of intuition that something might lead is as interesting as thinking of, wrapping up a kind of argument. We first thought of the idea to kind of reread visionary cities through a particular perspective, a kind of polemically green, let's say, perspective. Because we felt at the time we started, my partner Dan Wood and I had started a seminar in 2003 at Princeton looking at the relationship between ecology and urbanism, and although it since has become really a kind of important topic with conferences, etc., at the time we found that and we still do find that somewhat, that there was a kind of a lack of ambition in terms of thinking of these two in relationship, and that a lot of the more contemporary plans and ideas had been thought of already in a maybe even more ambitious way. It's as if we have the technology today, but maybe not the ambition always. At the same time, we were kind of attracted to this idea that the visionary in itself has an agency, whether you implement it or not. One that can be even more powerful than its actualization. And so, it was the actual book was the result of a research we did over a summer, and resulted in an exhibition at Storefront for Art and Architecture, which ended up publishing the book. And again, just showing, while clearly ideas about ecology have been going around for some time, this is the kind of Soleri's map of despair, where he takes Doxiadis' kind of lines of density, lines where density should exist, liberating the rest to nature. Basically, Soleri says, well, that's, you really have very little left. And so these conversations have been going on for some time. And so, But rather than only taking architects or urbanists who had a sort of declared ecological ambition, we decided to just take everyone and flatten it. And one of the reasons was that we sort of, for one, were kind of realizing that, especially in kind of, let's say, pre-industrial visions, you know, the kind of relationship between the urban and the rural and the natural were always taken into account, and even during industrialization, and that somehow falls. Sometimes in the 60s, that became very evident in our study, where, you know, these three spheres are no longer thought of as one, or as in relation. And the second was this kind of desire to maybe, you know, quantify and sort of flatten ideology, or rather look at the relationship between declared ideology and form, declared ideology and numbers, and to measure those drawings and those visions in kind of very precise, or as precise as we could get, manner, and kind of contrast it to the declared sort of positions, or the kind of layers of interpretation that had kind of read them and covered them. And so we really relied very heavily on either the actual writing of the architects or their drawings, rather than on kind of critical readings of them. And so we looked at over 200 or 250 cities, and we ended up selecting 49 of them. I would say part of it was a sense that we wanted to pick the ones that were the most seminal. Obviously, we wanted to pick those that represented a certain tendency. We also, did pick a few lesser known cities, such as Neutra's Rush City Reformed, or Merite Matins, Rattington West. And I know, like, this past semester there was a conference on the Goodmans, but Comunitas and Comunitas 1 and Comunitas 2 are cities that are maybe less well known. I have to say that not as a kind of something that we were very conscious of, and that in the end maybe is a lack, but as a body, all of the cities ended up being more Western, let's say, because they kind of seem to fit within, kind of respond to each other, and it would have been a kind of much larger project had we expanded beyond. Not to say that we couldn't and we shouldn't in the future do that, but it seems to us it would be a kind of different project. One of the first organization, and you've seen it in the book, was of course just a very simple chronological timeline, and just I don't have a pointer, but this, the cities were always thought of and then and imagined by architects, and it was almost like as an architect you had to think of the city. And I know that today it feels very normal. I mean, GSAPP is certainly one of the places where the ideas of urbanization, cities, etc., are thought of very heavily. But there is a kind of moment in the kind of early 70s where it stops, and we do enter the 80s and questions of autonomy and a kind of coming back to the scale of architecture, and the city is sort of dropped, or at least it becomes something different, and that's very clear in kind of the timeline that kind of we set up. And the second was a kind of another form of organization, which was the fear timeline. It was interesting for us to sort of across time, I guess, combine or look at which cities were imagined in reaction to sprawl, in reaction to noise, to chaos, slums, overcrowding, all of these kind of fears, which are again fears that we are talking about, and kind of reacting or trying to kind of project again a different future. So there's a kind of parallel to today again. And that kind of grouping allows to sort of start to combine cities that may not, have anything in common at first, or visions that may not have anything common at first glance. And the second way, or third, is of course scale, which was, quite fascinating just to compare, clusters in the air to, I don't know, Fort Worth or No Stop City, and just have a sense of, how small some of the initial visionary cities were, how bloated some of Solari's plans were, and I'll talk about that later. So this is a kind of, scale comparison, which then became very useful for us. And finally, a number of kind of diagrams. So I mentioned the fear factor. Form, obviously, kind of important and very strong in terms of the way we chose to represent the various visions, whether the cities were realized or not. Very few were realized. I think there's just like the Roman city and I forget what, but very few. And whether it was expandable or not. But the most important, I think, is, and that's why it kind of took on a little bit this this green tone, was that rather than focusing solely on the white, the built, the kind of the architecture, we would really focus on the shades of green, on the rural, on the open space, on the natural, etc., and look at these relationships along with water and infrastructure. So that was kind of, trying to kind of shift the focus from the white to the green, very literally. Just as a kind of, most cities, most visionary cities that we studied were grids, and that's very interesting in terms of the flexibility of the grid literally across different ideologies, from the kind of Roman or the Spanish colonialist cities to Rem Koolhaas's Exodus. So, but that flexibility in some ways, or the fact that form and ideology don't necessarily match, is somewhat carried to both the irregular and the linear city, very different agendas adopted, kind of more so-called, irregular or organically shaped cities. The radial, I would say, so there's 11 irregular cities and 11 linear cities, and then 7. The radial is really the kind of biggest statement of a sort of a kind of very enclosed, pure form. But again, also crosses different ideologies. In terms of the grid, it goes from the Roman city, the Latin America city, Jeffersonville. I don't know if you know this plan, but it's an amazing checkerboard of agricultural plots and built plots. The Cité Industrielle, also a grid. Broadacre City, as much as one thinks of Frank Lloyd Wright as this kind of flowery American architecture, he was a modernist and really kind of embraced the grid for Broadacre City, similarly to Corbusier's Radiant City or Archizoom's No Stop City, and more recently Masdar by Foster, kind of returned to sort of a kind of Roman walled city typology. Linear cities, the oldest one in 1910 is Road Town, very interesting, and then Bridge City by Yona Friedman. So this idea that you can combine housing and infrastructure, has a long history, and that has become very influential to us, but is, sort of really interesting. All of the, or many of the kind of metabolists, the idea of a kind of tree with the stems and the branches, and so this is Tokyo Bay. All of the networked kind of ideas about cities, Team 10. This is Candelis, Joseph Woods, Toulouse, Le Mirail, but this kind of layering of network were all kind of linear cities. And finally, Exodus, which is sort of somewhere between a grid and a linear city. And radial cities, I mean, what the wall used to do in terms of protecting the inside from the outside. This is Neuf-Brisach, a kind of very military kind of fortress-like city, really becomes, or where the radio can also create a sort of panopticon. It also can do the opposite, which is protect the outside from the inside when you think of sprawl. And so this is Howard's Garden City. So this is a kind of a reversal of what takes priority, the kind of inside versus the outside in terms of protecting. And these were this is Comunitas 1, which I mentioned earlier, and Comunitas 2. And finally, for the irregular cities, I mean, again, it's very hard to draw the line, literally, sometimes, but some of the network cities we ended up putting under here. This is the Smithson's Hauptstadt. This is Kikotake's Ocean City, and of course, Kurokawa's Helix City, and sorry, Solari's missing, but of course he would be completely in those. The main argument for us started to shape up when we decided to really focus on this question of density. The density as maybe what we would declare as, let's say, good, or on the kind of gradient of successful versus not. Density became one of the qualities that we kind of highlighted as important. And so, of Fuller's tetrahedral city is, way up in terms of density. 200 stories around a public park, 1 million people, and 300,000 apartments. You can't get better than that. Just stuff the people in the pyramid, let it float, and we'll be done. But interestingly enough, Archigrams plug-in city does very well in terms of density, and so does Cedric Price's Fun Palace. Another plan, so this is where some of the kind of observations start to come out. A plan such as the dome over Manhattan does also very well, Fuller's dome, which suggests that, actually, Manhattan, even when it was a lower density at the time of Fuller's kind of drawing, was already quite dense in an interesting way. And so just preserving kind of the urban kind of density would be considered a positive. So this was interesting for us. For those of you who know Paolo Solari, who studied with Frank Lloyd Wright and really was one of the first to to declare ecology as his main project, wrote a book called Ecology, City in the Image of Man, and one of his slogans was miniaturize or die. And Solari's, this is the coastal waters plan, is one of the least dense. So while there's a kind of image of, natural setting, the performance, let's say, is not as good, according to, again, deciding on density as being good. We looked at FAR, and where some cities make up in FAR what they don't have in density, such as in Solari's. This one is a bit higher in density. We also looked at population, and so population is really interesting. This is 5 million people for Kenzo Tonge, 4 million people for Hilbesheimer as planned to kind of displace population from Chicago itself to the suburbs. This is just to compare. So here you start understanding, what a suburban density is, or was or is projected as, versus, let's say, a kind of a metabolist density, and these two are at the same scale. So it's no surprise that the suburbs aren't doing very well. Another really interesting density comparison is, on the one hand, Radiant City on the right, and then Solari again. This is where the kind of the form and the ideology don't really match, or are kind of drastically opposed in some ways. Continuous Monument has 1 million people. Radiant City has 2 million. And then finally, we looked at open space. And, cities that, and this is where I guess some of our project starts, is to look at really the cities that declared very clearly that relationship between the urban, the rural, and the natural. So Kurokawa's agricultural city does very well. It's floating, it has green underneath it, but it also is about housing in a kind of agricultural setting for farmers, etc., and fishermen. And is a grid, so it's a kind of drop of urbanity in the middle of this kind of rural setting. Ebenezer Howard's Garden City is also, really interesting in terms of setting not only an economy and a sort of cooperative amongst the people, but declares that every city is really 5,000 acres of agriculture, 1,000 acres of city, and 2,065 acres of parkland. So it's a kind of very measured kind of relationship that he sets up. The moment one of these these garden cities become too dense, you don't sprawl it, you just kind of connect it to another garden city through infrastructure, train, and other means. Fourier is another one that really combines these three spheres together. One wing is for kind of play, one wing is for work, and there's farmland around. And Radiant City, with Corb putting or declaring that the roofs would be green and then under the pilotis would be green, it really becomes a kind of an idea of some form of green occupying every single possible surface. And so in some kind of sort of conclusion, in a way, just trying to say and take a position on what we felt were the sort of winners of our little experiment, both Fuller's Dome, Fuller's Tetrahedral City and Radiant City do best in terms of this combination of open space, FAR, and density. And so in some ways, with a kind of this new lens, we start to look at two architects that have often, been sort of placed in contrast to one another. Fuller is a scientist whose kind of dreams have yet to be executed in an intelligent form, and Corb is, if you think, especially from a kind of North American perspective, is very much the has been vilified for what is seen as a consequence of his plans, office parks, etc., etc. And so, starting to look at, kind of shifting that, by shifting perspective, starting to look at their intersections and interests. And another kind of interesting aspect for us was to, again, take two figures that represent very different attitudes. Let's say Frank Lloyd Wright, the return to the land, the kind of declarations of being anti-urban and city being kind of the reason for all evil, culture, etc. This sort of myth of actually, in some ways, if again we look at it from the lens of this research, they becomes close to some of the interests that Corbusier had in terms of this kind of gridded city that brought together the urban, the natural, and actually the rural. Looking at Le Corbusier and rereading Radiant City, realizing that Corb wasn't just obsessed with sports fields, but also had a whole program of urban farming where every 150 inhabitants would have 100 meters squared, I think, of plots that would be combined and organized in terms of a kind of farming system. And also to kind of acknowledge that his kind of imagination in terms of what the green would be wouldn't necessarily be kind of lawn and but something that closer to a kind of less tamed, wilder form of nature, so that maybe Radiant City is really a city in wilderness, although that's not maybe the right word, but not the kind of flatness that we imagine when we see the more current images of Villa Savoie. And so here you can see the kind of sports fields and the kind of residential quarters of Radiant City versus the kind of urban farming plots that would also occupy the residents when they came back from work. In a similar combination, but much more stretched, of the Broadacre cities, orchards, and small houses combination. And so, and that, some of these concerns, again, go back to Howard's kind of organization. So it's the organization of these three kind of elements or spheres that we start to really be interested in. And just again, going back to what I was saying originally or earlier, this idea that somehow that like linking, that setting up of the relationship between these three sort of gets lost in the 60s and the 70s. And if you think, well, the 70s there's a kind of return, but certainly in the 60s, if you think of Archigrams, well, first there's a lot of these, the kind of, this is again the Smithson, the network city feels like it exists on top of a network city. Suddenly we're not just, in a way, plugging into nature, we're plugging into an existing context. Same with Constance Babylon, right? It's a kind of insertion within a kind of existing built fabric. And then, you look at Archigram and you think of the TV dinners and the pills instead of meals, and, this notion of the disposable architecture. And that's where our kind of interview with Michael Webb was very interesting. The Archigram often used this word environment, but it was never to mean the environment as we mean it today. It was the experience of a kind of new type of architectural experience, I guess. And, I asked Michael, what were you plugging into? He's like, well, we didn't know. We didn't really care. And so you plug into an existing city, but where that city gets its food from, or how it's, what is its extended relationship, beyond its visible boundaries even, is not of great concern. And this is, this here is where maybe the representation fails a little bit. I think that you have the sense that, okay, our, No Stop Cities is green, but it's actually a very different kind of green. It's a green of parking lots, of lawns, of golf courses and shopping malls. Not exactly the kind of rural or natural green of the Garden City. So here is where some of the kind of representation tools start to give in a little bit. But again, the continuous monument, this idea that you insert within Manhattan, or Exodus. We told Rem we had reread Exodus from a green perspective. He thought it was very funny. And so just to kind of, but just to take us to another branch, of course, in the 70s, Ant Farm. I love this drawing because Convention City, which I know some of you are looking in studio at, is actually connected, right? There's this like umbilical cord to something, and there's this kind of concern that what are we plugging into, sort of, which is quite interesting. And actually, Ant Farm was concerned, obviously, with again, a different kind of environment which had to do with air and other factors. And so just to kind of bring, in terms of, I'm assuming, the series argument is also about how you as students or us as, practicing in the world, start to formulate a position. A lot of these ideas made it into our projects, even at a much smaller scale. I won't explain the projects, but this is our Public Farm 1 installation. We won the competition for the GSAPP program at MoMA in 2008, which is a a farm built out of cardboard tube, a 1/4 acre. We're doing, as Helen mentioned, the edible schoolyard with Alice Waters, which is one of hopefully many in New York, taking, sort of transforming asphalt, yards in school into productive gardens and kitchen classrooms. This was an entry for a kind of a fish farm that would double as a sushi restaurant for Shenzhen. This was a response to New York Magazine asking us to design a new condominium. This was like right before the crisis. And it was a sort of, again, a kind of terraced urban farming idea with culture supporting it. Again, kind of, so a lot of these ideas made it to some of these obviously unbuilt projects. This is a winning competition for Shenzhen in Huashangbei, really working on kind of infrastructure and architecture and its relationship to potentially kind of open space in the city. This is a competition for a new master plan for Pingshan near Shenzhen, where the idea of a kind of belted green perimeter and combining infrastructure with new kinds of public spaces that would double up as ecological infrastructure. And finally, our entry for the foreclosed rehousing the American dream at MoMA. This is Nature City, where a lot of the ideas came into play again for the American suburb. And that's it. One other thing Michael Webb said, he said when he was at school, they would, right after school, they would work during the day and then get together at night and just design a city. That's what people did. So you guys know what to do tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd like to, begin by asking you to talk a little bit more about the idea of ecology in relation to the city that you're kind of working within this book. And I'm just wondering, you talk very much about how density was kind of the key parameter of how you measure ecology. And I'm wondering, when you were first setting up the project, whether there were other kinds of criteria that you thought about using as, kind of factors that you could measure from one project against another. So, for example, things like infrastructure, like transportation infrastructures, like circulation systems, or perhaps even issues such as the sort of flexibility or expandability of a plan, which would mean, facilitating sort of reuse rather than redundancy, as in the sort of plug-in city model. So I'm just wondering if there were other factors that could have come into an analysis of what is the ecology of the city.
Definitely, and I think that actually we did, in the kind of diagrams that we had, we did measure everything from population to examine infrastructure, look at water, expandability, and I think in the end, it was a little bit of a combination of all those factors. It was sometimes difficult to get as clear about, let's say, infrastructure, the actual infrastructure, but we kind of try to measure it the best. So clearly, all of these factors would come into play, but the relationship between the actual measurement between density and open space became key. Because sure, Fuller's pyramid is amazingly dense, but do we really want to, if you take it very literally, obviously, which we probably shouldn't, but we did. This is where density goes probably too far. And I think that it's very interesting today. A lot of the conversations are exactly, what density is, like what is the range that we can work with. And I think I'm thinking of MDRDV's projects, KM3, and which obviously we're very attuned to, and their experiments, and so that it's still for us. It just became, this is still the main question, like how dense is dense, and that became the main question for our Nature City project. Like, well, how do you create a new kind of density that it's neither here nor there?
Also to echo the thanks for the great presentation, and to kind of tag on to the last question, but maybe frame it a bit more broadly. I'd be interested to hear you position the book, which I think is an argument, even though you kind of hesitated to say. I think it's an argument, it's safe to say, within the history of recent books on the city, let's say, because over the last, and you're probably a victim of this, having worked in OMA, the last 10, 15 years, one of the key moves in books on the city has been to actually do field work on the ground and actually observe the city as it's, let's say, evolving before our eyes, and then to subject that to some type of statistical analysis, or maybe extract from it some kind of statistical analysis. Whereas with this book, you've very consciously gone in the opposite direction, right? Which is not to look at the city that's in front of us today, but to look at, let's say, the fantasies of architects and other co-conspirators over the last 2,000 years. And to subject that to a similar type of statistical reading. So I'd be curious as to hear your positioning of the project in relationship to other projects on the city, right? Because it seems like it's going in a very different direction.
No, I absolutely. I think that part of the reason for the book was a kind of exhaustion with the field research. Not that it's not necessary. I think it's actually very refreshing. But as you say, it's been 10 and 15 years now. So it felt to us like, should we stop and evaluate what we've learned? And should we also consider that we are maybe somewhere we've been before many, many times? So that was one question. Like, we've seen this before. How did anyone, how did someone dream about it? The other question for us, and it came about a lot with Nature City, was this notion that as architects we aren't necessarily here to serve a certain audience, but maybe to produce one, and that this is a very different position where you're not on the ground asking a certain community how they would like to live, but rather imagine how we would all like to live collectively, actually, which is a little, and then see if anybody points and says, hey, so the idea that you can produce, and all of these visions did produce audiences, and that's what's amazing. I mean, in some ways you could, Radiant City might have been a disaster in Paris, it might have resulted in catastrophes in America for many other reasons, but it's doing pretty well in Asia. So also to think that these kind of sightless, or even though they were intended to have a sight, in the end they're kind of visions, right? Could have been adapted in many forms, and so then when you're doing your field work, you can assess, well, this is a kind of interpretation of the Garden City. How is it different? What did it lose? Or it's just this feeling that I think sometimes we're not, the field work isn't adding up.
So in some senses, the project becomes as much a self-reflexive one as it is about the city out there, right? It's a kind of almost auto-critique through a kind of typological reading of the profession in some sense.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And it's also, we're all, and especially you are all like, living in this kind of constant present, right? And it's almost overwhelming, the amount of content and information and with very little editorial and to kind of dive back, of course, in history is really refreshing in terms of pulling out again, kind of ideas that are incredibly contemporary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nice. Who has the first question?
So, this project that you showed at the end of your office are all after that research? Are those your conclusions of the research you made for the cities?
I wouldn't say they're conclusions, but I would say they are definitely continuing to explore some of the themes that we set ourselves to explore in the book. And yeah, I think PS1 was almost at the same time, and after that, yeah, they all came afterwards.
You stated that your interests were not in knowing how each individual person lives, but how they collectively live together. And with the book's sort of plan diagrams showing the top-down planning, it seems like you're taking the position that utopia is a homogeneous condition.
That what is a homogeneous?
That utopia is a homogeneous condition.
I don't know that utopia is a homogeneous condition. I'm not sure I would. What do you mean by utopia is a homogeneous condition?
I just am interested in the sort of finding these ideal cities. Even in the exhibitions, you've sort of marked the winner, and it seems like you're
that's the
finding the ratio
part.
of green space to planning or to built space is finding a utopia, and it seems like when you say that how we all live together is
I think there's been a lot of debate and conversation about top down, bottom up, and I really feel that it's a false debate. This is a debate that's been ongoing with the foreclosed, rehousing the American dream. There's nothing more top-down than the American suburb. Nothing. I mean, it was planned from A to Z. Highways were planned. The car industry was planned. It is still planned. It is still completely tied with capital and flows. And so, so I really don't know what is bottom up, and I don't know what is bottom up. Not that I don't know, but I'm not sure there's such a kind of division. If you look at a lot of the, the kind of informal gatherings, they often occur around infrastructure. I'm thinking of, just to take an example, like RAM studies of Lagos and the markets, and we're now doing a competition in Gabon, and they just destroyed a kind of amazing market that was a very modernist structure that was just a roof, and destroyed it because it was favoring informal organization. So I think this notion that the form and the informal can't work together is something that I don't feel is a strong. For me, it's a kind of false debate again. And if you look at it from the perspective of the so-called environment, or we cannot not plan. I mean, infrastructure needs to be planned. The idea that you can just lay, and again, I'm taking the American suburb as an example, you just grow organically and just lay down these roads isn't working very well. So I think we have to consider that there is, first of all, there's been lots of top-down planning. It never disappeared. Second, can we do top-down planning in a smarter way? And as for the audience, I think that it depends. I think that all of the various kind of visionaries probably projected different audiences that would occupy these spaces, or that you can't necessarily plan for, or how people appropriate the space. And in our Nature City example, just because I can specifically talk to this notion of audience, we were very particular about imagining diversity, and diversity of scales of units, diversity of landscapes, diversity of housing typologies, diversity. You don't want to live there, you don't have to, but it's not a question of homogeneity necessarily.
If I could jump in quickly with a question. I mean, we were in my session today. We were struck by that. The students brought an image of Nature City, and the question came up about the relationship between research and practice in this particular case. And I heard you briefly say that was the irony when she had talked about who was the winner in the strategy, right? So I guess the question is about what is the kind of conceit in the book, right? If it's an argument, it also has a kind of conceit. And one of the conceits is that, in fact, you might arrive at a kind of scale of the greatest ideal cities of all time and rank them on a kind of chart. And I'm curious, I think some of the students may be reading it that way. I'd like to hear from your side what the kind of ambition was in using this rhetoric of quantitative analysis for something which resists it in many ways, right?
Yeah, I think that the irony was, when quantification gets you to literally, declare a winner. That was particularly for Storefront. It was a lot of fun to actually, give the winner their medals. But I think it's more, the interest for us was to go beyond the declared ideologies and the kind of, again, the kind of layers of interpretation, and almost, strategically, naively look at these very literally and see if we can start to find common grounds in terms of the different approaches, or at least the kind of intentions, and start to weave connections between, that's why we have kind of Corb and Frank Lloyd Wright, and to start making these kind of connections also across time. It's sort of a flattening. And from that flattening, you start to have a new relief that appears, that is not necessarily one that has been the subject of writing. Every decade has its kind of particular critical intentions or focus, and it seems to us that we could kind of dust off these plans and look at them with kind of our concerns. So that was the kind of main goal. And as you said earlier, the kind of data scape is one of the tools that is very much of our time. So.
Yes, more than I am more interested in how you use the data in the book more than the formal analysis of the cities. But my question is, do you think that it's possible to develop an architecture directly from the data, or we need something more?
I think some people are trying to do that. And the jury is out. Do I think it's possible to only use data? Probably not. I hope not. I don't know. I mean, but certainly we could use data more smartly. I mean, I think if you just are talking from a pragmatic perspective, I mean, I'm thinking of the possibilities that kind of the parametric tool can have. But again, I think it's just a tool, and if you don't have an intention or a vision, yes, you'll have 100 options. Which one is better, right? And this was your question. So at some point, you start taking a position in terms of the better, right? Mm-hmm. And so, in that sense, the ranking maybe is the ironic part, but the taking a position is not. In terms of, can we think about the future again? And if so, what would be the better future? And that's a very polemical question after all the failed futures we've had. But it nevertheless, I mean, you guys, it's important, right?
Yeah, I was also interested in the fact of how do you actually measure an idea? in the sense that there are a lot of projects that are very difficult to judge in a data basics. And also, like, is this the importance of the project? Like, what does the quantity of the space is the importance, or is it the quality of the space? Because it seems from the reading of all those projects that the importance is how much open space do you have. But actually, like, the quality of this space, how is this space designed, is not actually something that it's bringing into the book.
Of course, quality is critical. In the particular research, we didn't give, quality. We kind of tried to quantify rather than qualify. But actually looking at the relationship, between the two. But I would say that in some ways it's interesting that the cities that use section, perform, in a more interesting way than the cities that don't. We just, again, in terms of the argument, we didn't declare that a round space or is a kind of higher quality than that was a kind of position that we took. Doesn't mean that we don't believe that one should take position on quality, but it was a larger question where quantity was is the way we thought we could enter. I mean, the drawings, like literally measuring them, became the tool. Proportion, scale, and
do you think cities are getting more general or more specific? Like, because in the case of the book, it seems that you sort of take all things that you need from its city and transform it. But I was just wondering to know if you think cities today are getting more specific, or how do you think we should be thinking about the cities today?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I think the assumption probably is that cities are, first you have to define cities, and if you take the kind of more general term, the assumption is that they're probably becoming more the same because of globalization, capital flows, forces that shape the cities today are seen to be more kind of economic forces than any other sort of visionary. We don't have even the UAE is not exactly Peter the Great. I mean, it's very much embedded in this kind of globalized context. On the other hand, I think there is still a lot of possibilities for kind of more localized expressions, or and I think that actually that's where the field work becomes interesting. I think is that when you go somewhere, if you go to Dubai, you realize there is a life, beyond the kind of glossy images that we see. That people, talking about how people are organizing their lives in a very real way, and that has a very specific flavor. So I don't think it's a either or. I think the images of cities are becoming more the same. It doesn't mean that the reality is.
Concerning some of the theoretical projects in the book, it's very hard to count the qualities because we never know exactly how they would act if they existed. So, and on top of that, for some of them, it exists a very little amount of documentation. So, I'm interested in finding out how did you generate the data? Did you hypothesize about them? Did you invent them? Did you invent scenarios about them?
Avery, you guys need to look at Avery.
I'll second that.
Yes, we're sitting on top of or next to a wealth of information. It was a lot. We looked. Well, that's where the selection also happened between the kind of 250 50 we selected, and then we had looked at, and then the 49 we selected, we redrew the cities, both in plan and in section. That gave us already quite a lot to work with. And then we relied on the texts, the writings of the architects themselves in terms of declared population or any hint that we could get. So as much as possible we didn't make up. I mean, we tried to be very earnest and scientific about it. And so for the cities where there was really a lack and we couldn't outline a particular, kind of clearer picture, that that was also one of the reasons we didn't include them. But that's another. There's a lot in drawings, and you as students, when you draw, I mean, the amount of information and knowledge and you can put in your drawing, it's not a diagram, it's not, I mean, there are diagrams, but these are not diagrams, and it's just amazing. I mean, amazing the amount of actual thinking that went into these drawings. So we kind of went back to the drawing.
I have a question that kind of follows up on that in relation to the selection of the projects. I mean, for me, the sort of inclusion of the Haussmann's plan for Paris was very much an outlier in the sense that most of the projects are very self-contained. They may be in relation to an existing city, but they're very much self-contained, whereas that Haussmann project is an intervention into existing urban fabric. And I'm wondering, in the larger sort of group of 200 or so projects that you looked at, whether you also looked at other kind of, I mean, I think you could argue that Haussmann's project was visionary, even though it's an intervention into the existing city. So I'm wondering if there were more projects along those lines, because it's like I said, very much an outlier in the book.
Well,
I feel
that's interesting that you feel that. I agree, but at the same time, it starts the network. Right, the kind of infrastructural intervention, and in some ways, I think we saw it as not a precursor, but if you think of Constant or the Smithsons, or even when there's not a context, there's almost this invention of a context on which something else is layered, or even REMS, and so it does suddenly your context is no longer the green open field where you're going to organize agriculture, and your context becomes the city. And so in that sense, we did feel that it was a kind of first cut within where you're starting to reshape a city that already exists. And I think you see that a lot in the kind of later plans. So that's how we kind of intervention as infrastructure, the city as infrastructure.
Hello. I have two questions. The first one being the notion of what a successful city means, because I guess whenever we try to create a visionary city, there's a pursuit of certain ideal as to what a city should represent or what it means to the inhabitants. So, I mean, from your own experience, what does a successful city mean, and when does a city fail? And
I think if you took the argument of the book, a successful city would be one that doesn't only think about its own boundaries, but also thinks about how it's connected to the so-called outside. So there's no inside and outside, even though there's a drawing of a kind of wall around it. It's actually a continuous exchange. Whether you're thinking of food or air or that level of connection. So that thinking would be kind of important in terms of if you were to design a city today. But obviously there are many other the book doesn't take a position on social concerns, or it kind of limits it to sort of more environmental concerns. But obviously those would it seems to me you would want to, if you were God, you would want to create diversity. You would want to and how you do that is not only is certainly not only or it's almost not at all a formal problem, and that becomes kind of, a whole project in itself. But I think that would be the position, right? To actually see a city as a set of relationships. And in that sense, the kind of data description can sometimes allow you to describe those relationships in a better way, or maybe more a way that you can instrumentalize more easily.
During the seminar, our professor presented this story about how he was asked to draw something with, or design something with the lawyers for Occupy Wall Street. And as soon as he presented himself as an architect, his significance was, they didn't value his opinion, basically. So when you present your argument that there is no discussion between top-down or bottom-up, don't you think we take away the public by saying statements like that? Or a lot of us did agree that top-down is the way to go to design a city, but shouldn't there be a discussion, or why shouldn't there be a discussion?
Oh yeah. I'm not saying I would like to only work for totalitarian regimes that would let me do whatever I want. I'm saying that all I'm saying is that I believe that it's not the right debate, or that it would be interesting to acknowledge that a lot of what people, let's say, I'm thinking of an interview on Fox News, a lot of what is served as bottom-up is not bottom-up. So first you have to define what is really top-down, because a lot of what is top-down is also not top-down. So, and a lot of what people imagine I'm an individual, I'm free, I'm gonna build my house, and but why is that house? Well, maybe it's because the only one I can afford, or it's the only one that's available. Why is it the only one that's available? Well, because that's the system. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying that it's a kind of cliche debate where you have to undermine, you have to dig down in terms of what it means when people suggest bottom up, and so in terms of the discussion, yes, of course, but I mean, we're always, listening and. But I think that there's also a space where you can retract as an architect and decide that you want to project a vision. And that's it. And produce 3 drawings. And Archigram went home and they drew plug-in city. You know what I mean? I mean, at some point, there's room for us to also say, I'd like to explore these ideas as a vision and see if they find resonance. So it's also about projecting something that you are imagining that someone else hasn't seen, and then when they see what you've imagined, it might resonate, right? So that's what I meant. That it's not just serving existing conditions, but also being able to step outside of the existing conditions and imagine others.
There and then down here. Well, up there and then down here. 2 shades of green. Maybe we could repeat the question, because I don't think your microphone was on. I don't know that everybody heard it.
Analysis like the previous step to a proposal. Are you going to propose city number 50?
Well, I would say that you can analyze and not propose anything. I mean, analysis can be a form of proposal in itself. I think that, yes. But I also do believe, I mean, Nature City, the project we did for MoMA, would come close to trying to tackle a lot of the issues. at once and propose a kind of vision, for a kind of suburban condition. So in that sense, we joke that this is our 50th city, but we haven't included it in the book, and we probably won't. But I think it's I don't know if we'll ever produce our own.
That's curious. I mean, I think I would love to see it in the book at some level, just to see how does it stack up in a sense, right? Like, do you actually think in those terms when you're working on something like Nature City? Do you work through some of the data categories, or does it work in a totally different way, more formally, typologically?
It was both. It was kind of a back and forth. We would go back and forth between the diagram and then the kind of. But we know exactly all the data. Like we know that it's, 3 times as open, as a neighboring suburb, 5 times as dense. We know the diversity of units in it. We know, so we could, actually that's a good idea. Maybe we should see where it ranks.
I want to go back for a second to the argument of the book that kind of you refuse to say that there's an argument in there. And
I am Gen X after all.
No, because actually some of the students in our section went and asked Dan about the argument of the book and showed us a little video when he claims that actually the book was done for the office. That actually is a tall books. I mean, it's a shortcut. Now you were saying the thing about the foreclosure, and it's a really interesting point. Like actually, the work is super useful as a design tool, basically, because it allows you to place the work that you're doing at the moment. It's basically a manual, and actually, let's say half of the session was supporting that idea. It's a fantastic manual to work and push further the kind of architectural knowledge, let's say. Another section of the group was saying that actually that's not so interesting. What's interesting is actually pushing something that you say at the beginning, that is there's been a gap from the late 70s to the present in which architects have refused to actually put forward proposals of cities. And this works as a kind of, it's a polemical statement.
Right.
It's a kind of a manifesto of manifestos in a way, if each of these cities is a little manifesto. To claim like the right of the architect to actually produce ambitions of how the city should be. Okay, so we have these two things, and then I have a kind of hypothesis. Looking at the book and your claims about kind of refusing ideology in favor of other kind of values, more measurable ones. I think one of the most interesting things, and maybe can solve the question about toolkit or can be a kind of a direction, is when you look at the book, a specific kind of architectural tool that is repeated over and over is the plan.
Right.
No, is the plan. So basically, cities are defined in plan. That is actually a kind of, let's say, kind of nostalgic in a way, and like probably the last 15 examples of your book were designed against the idea that cities could be designed in plan. Like starting from a kind of archigram, a plug-in city. There are literally cities that resist a lot the possibility of being displayed in plan and would even never before been drawn in plan, no? In a way. So why? I mean, is that a claim? Is that, like we should be looking back to the city designing plan, to a city kind of post-arts in a way? I mean, like a kind of, and is that the claim of that actually visions for cities should recover that kind of bottom up? I mean, sorry, top down, because I think the plan of the city draw as such, and from Roman to the Latin American city to the Phalanstère, is about top down operations in which the architect is still in control, not necessarily in designing every single building, but actually being really precise about setting up divisions of public and private and things like that. So is that the argument?
I think that, I mean, it's a great comment. I think that certainly the kind of declared argument is we should be thinking about cities again and, and the future. Right? I mean, right? How polemical is it, you know, for architects to say, you know, we're actually interested in the future, and through the past, that you know, there is maybe a need again to open up the conversation about the future, even a collective future. So that certainly is kind of, you know, part of the kind of argument of the book. I think it's, you know, we had the kind of plan. It was interesting because it's something that is both a result of the fact that these cities were already described in plan, that we described them in plan, so that and for us the addition, the kind of changing of the colors changed the diagram, right, where the white wasn't necessarily the predominant, but then the void, the leftover space kind of took over, and that is very clear in plan and in diagram. So that the plan or the diagram can still be a very useful tool to simply look diagrammatically at these relationships. And then the idea that data would come and complement the plan, right? That the diagram isn't enough, and you also need to quantify. And I wouldn't say that there's necessarily nostalgia for the plan, but certainly there is a call for the master plan, right? That again, and this is something that was very polemical in our Nature City, is that, look, if you want to talk seriously about, you know, the kind of, that there's no such thing as no master plan. Again, the suburbs have been master planned, so okay, let's do another master plan, or try to imagine, rather than this kind of vilifying of planning. That there is space for planning. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that it is necessarily equal to top down and all these things that we. So that, yes, we can claim the plan again to a certain extent, but understand its limitations. That's why you add other shades and you start to add data. And I think it would have been interesting, you know, if we were to expand on the book to try to describe these relationships also differently, you know, as, I don't know, networks or different kinds of quantities, and start to visualize things differently would be really interesting. But even at that basic level, we can go beyond somehow. This is what kind of, I think even with these simple tools, you can measure quite a bit.
Just one question regarding this gap. More than half of the book is devoted to 14 years, from 1960 to 1974, and there's a very explicit silence until 2006, when appears the project by Norman Foster for Abu Dhabi. I think it's becoming a failure in terms of carbon zero emissions, because the concrete they have to use, the amounts of concrete they have to use are overwhelming.
The amount of what?
Of concrete they have to use for the foundations, I think are overwhelming. So, I mean, all the ecological aspect of the project is a bit right now at stake. Mm-hmm. But my question was, among those 100 to 200 cities you were thinking about, you didn't find any proposal from that period? I don't know, I was thinking West State proposals or anything that got into your attention, or is the argument that mainly in the last 30 years there was an incapacity on the side of the architects to deal with the urban environment?
It's not an incapacity to deal with the urban environment. It's a fear of projecting a vision. I think that's different, right? A declared visionary plan, right? Where you say the future is you're going to live in a pyramid and it's going to float, and you know, I mean, and I don't think it's crazy, you know, that level of just like, and you know, of course, there's many reasons for that, you know, both kind of the 80s were much more concerned certainly with architecture probably than they were, or if they were concerned with cities, it was a very different concern. And there wasn't that much. I mean, that kind of which now is back. I mean, there's been a kind of, you return to this, to kind of the utopian as something that is a possibility, as a kind of thinking process, that is productive in some ways.
In the conversation that you reproduce in the end of the book with Michael Webb and Joseph Grima, at some point I think you comment, or I forget whom of the interlocutor says that you had talked to Winnie Maas and that he mentioned something in regards to pragmatism, no? And that perhaps what visionary projects of the, something in relation to visionary plus pragmatism, that's the duty of today, no? And Michael Webb replies and says, no, leave the pragmatism outside. A visionary has to be always someone like crying out loud alone in the forest or something with a visionary idea. And I connected that to part of what I at least analyzed in the Foreclosed show, that the 5 projects, and it's something that was confirmed by Reinhold when he was here, he suggested, okay, first of all, none of these projects are public housing, he said. And second of all, they're all trying to invent an economical model that's efficient and viable for a developer. So perhaps in those 5 examples, there was a clear strain of pragmatism that got into the mix with what was visionary. Would you also evaluate many of the projects after 74 as having more pragmatism and less vision? Because certainly Norman Foster wasn't the only project that was done from 75 onwards, no? By architects.
That's a very good question. I think I don't entirely disagree with Michael Webb now. In 2012, post-Obama hype of 2008, a little bit, who would have been the ultimate pragmatist visionary, right? I mean, I certainly represents that. I think the jury is out about the performance somewhat, at least for me. And we've had this conversation with Mini quite a lot, and I think he's very interested in that idea, and so are we, but I'm not sure that it's the right way to go. I mean, at some point I think you have to drop pragmatism, and I think that's what that's why we picked, in a way, we picked the projects that were not pragmatic. So does that mean that post-75 they are more pragmatic? I don't know, I'm not sure. Maybe the 90s, but not before. I think there is just a dropping of the kind of visionary as having any kind of positive agency somehow. In terms of the Foreclosed show, Reinhold is very upset that nobody did public housing, but we had a lot of debates about that, I think internally, even amongst our team, whether public housing was the right way to go. That maybe there were other models that were not, where you would integrate housing within, that you wouldn't segregate public housing, that it would be integrated. That was our position. That maybe you didn't need an architecture for public housing. That was a stance that we took. It doesn't mean that we. And then it's true. I think there is the pragmatic quality is a little bit. For us, the city would set the public would set the vision, right, with a very clear master plan, right. The vision is diversity, density, and that whether it was done by the city itself or whether it was built by a developer, we didn't care. But maybe we should.
Just one more question. It's perhaps of a different nature. How did the Fun Palace make it into being a city?
Yes, I know. It's such a great vision. I mean, look, the Fun Palace made it into Foreclosed. I mean, Jeannie Gang's scheme is very much a kind of Fun Palace idea. So we just felt that it was such a strong, it's almost scaleless, the Fun Palace, in terms of, even though it had a scale, but actually as a kind of paradigm, it's scaleless, and I mean, it's just that's how it made it. It's just such a, you can scale it to a city, you can scale it to a house. So that's our city-house connection.
There was a question there. Do you have the microphone?
One thing I was curious about is, as we can see that there are numerous ranking charts at the end of the book. Well, my question is how we can utilize the rankings, for instance, as a tool for other architects, or can we take the rankings as the overall findings of the book? Let's say it's a preliminary step for this particular phase, or rather a kind of resource that can remain for others to rethink, because yeah.
Mm-hmm. One idea we had for the book, and maybe we would still do, would be to do it more like not an open source, but where we would kind of give data over to you, or where people could kind of rearrange the numbers, or if density wasn't the most important thing, you would kind of, going back to your question, you would say, because we use the data in a certain way, but somebody could use the data in a different way. I think that certainly we could apply the same analysis to contemporary cities, like we did to Masdar, and make a similar kind of assessment. But probably everybody, probably you, if you were to assess something, you probably would assess it differently. So in that sense, it takes, there is a point of view, which is how we've used the data. So yes, you could probably take this tool and kind of readjust it to give priority to some of your concerns. I don't know if that answers your question.
Hands popping up everywhere here.
You characterize your different cities with different types, and when you're designing your cities, like the one near Shenzhen, maybe, how do you define your city? Like, what's the type of city? And when you're designing the city as a continuum, what kind of experience are you providing to the citizens or the people in the city?
Well, when we're designing a city as a continuum, you said? Or?
Yeah. Like, as a city itself, what experience are you providing to the...
We haven't designed that many cities, but for Shenzhen, the form of it was very much a result of the boundary of it was very much a result of the kind of a sort of ecological conditions around it, and we combined in a way the grid with the kind of garden city boundary. So we created a green belt, which is common in Europe or in certain areas, region. But then inside, I think so far every time we did whether it's Nature City or the kind of Pingshan master plan, the grid at different scales still has a very strong place. And so that's how we designed it. And then trying to rethink infrastructure, both to serve sort of certain ecological functions, as well as create new kinds of public spaces and experience is something that we've looked at in particular. And freedom within the block, somehow.
Okay, I have a question between the research and practice. And we had a presentation of foreclosed 2 weeks ago, so I'm interested about Nature City. Although I know that Nature City is designed to solve the problem of foreclosure, but if this design is driven by this research is data or driven by something else? Did you collect the data or the information of nature city and compare it with the 49 cities?
Yes, I think that's what Craig was alluding to, that this is something that we should do. We will do. I'll send you an email, let you know how we we did generate quite a bit of data, but we never put it aside. But false modesty, probably. We'll try it.
I was I thought it was an extraordinary provocation to put 49 terrified visionaries, no? The central organizing principle is fear, no? Cities, the bond of cities is fear. Different types of fear, and different types of fear produce different visions. So basically, these visionaries are terrified people, basically, just putting forth the collective phobias, And in the end of the conversation, we get into this point that, well, we got eaten up because we are even afraid to plan. Fear.
We got what?
Eaten up by fear, basically. It's an endless source of social control. Right. We've been using it and abusing it, of course, in the last 10 years. But towards the end of this conversation, we were asking why, after the hippies, and all the revolutions, after our revolutionary dreams died in sometime around the oil crisis of 73, 74, maybe we got eaten up by fear, and we are afraid of planning. We are afraid of, of a unified discourse, basically. The simple question is, are we postmodern because we are terrified visionaries, or simply because we don't like modern visionaries? I mean, what is the engine now?
That's a very good question. Yes, it's not. We like the fear timeline because it also because a lot of while the book has a certain strategic kind of freshness, it also is trying to be a little bit polemical and careful, and this just gives it a. I think it would be too sweet if we didn't have the fear timeline. So it just also sets all these visions not only were a result of fears, but created fear, right? I mean, it's just like, the utopias that created dystopias, and I mean, it's just, yes, okay. But I guess part of the argument is, even with all that, can we still try? If not, what are we doing? In that sense, I think that what was interesting for us about the foreclosed show is whether it was about public housing or not. It at least said, okay, it's time to try again and open up various conversations again. And I think that has been received very negatively, actually. I mean, in America at least, or very strongly. Like, you're opening up doors that. And it's very interesting once you hear that, because you just get this mountain of cliches, that you have to start unraveling. Form is not the cause of all social ills. I mean, I think Pruitt-Igoe didn't fail, because of its architecture, etc., etc., etc. So once you kind of open up the door, things can unravel, and you can maybe have a place for a new conversation. But certainly, it's good to fear. If not, we would be monsters.
My question is actually related to that fear timeline. Fear relating to the radical new solutions in city planning. Are you in your practice tackling very specific fears and anxieties of our time and the very near future,
one thing about the new, right? Because and this is maybe because we did grow up in the postmodern. One of the reasons why we liked to go back is to claim that things are not new, right? So that or if they are, you have to look at the genealogy and that it's not like yes, there is invention, but invention is often reinvention or a tweaking or and that is kind of important. I think the second idea is also to shift perspective, right? So that maybe the shift from the white to the green is also, are we the most important kind of species alive on the planet? Maybe we're not. Maybe you shift the perspective to plants and to animals, and suddenly Fuller's pyramid doesn't seem so outrageous anymore. I mean, it would be great, we just, get it. So just to kind of be polemical enough to say, well, we also should shift perspective in terms of, is it necessarily always anthropocentric, and can it, now, so this is very postmodern, right? You had gender, you had, and now you have plants, and so I think in that sense, I mean, to answer some of the questions in terms of our own concerns, we have focused more on the kind of environmental, although not so much in Nature City, but where you kind of prioritize certain things, knowing that in the end, if something was built, it would be transformed in many ways.
It's a kind of interesting way that the discussion has arced. I mean, I think the exchange that you had about planning and actually putting a master plan back on the table has been a really fruitful way to kind of summarize the argument. And the question that I have, I guess, relates to what you described as the environmental or ecological aspect of the book, how that relates to this desire to put the master plan back on the table, and why ecology is the mode by which master planning comes back. Because if we look at our timeline and this kind of fear cliff, right, where things sort of stop happening in the 70s, at that time period, I mean, I think it was part of all the ideological differences going on that produced these different plans, right? There was a kind of very clear relationship between different ideological positions and different plans. And partly what you've done is said we're going to take those ideological differences off the table, right? And compare Frank Lloyd Wright to Le Corbusier and others and sort of make them appear for a moment in time not so different. And I wonder if that kind of suspending of ideology and the putting of ecology in its place, what does that do for us today? Because I feel like there is a lot of ideology embedded in ecology, right? And that needs to be kind of teased out in some way. I don't know if that's clear. But
No, I mean, I understand. I think you're right. There's a tremendous amount of ideology in ecology right now, and it certainly is a tool that is abused in many ways. I think the reason why it appeared to be in a kind of appropriate lens was both because it's a kind of our contemporary ideology in some sense, but the second is because it could be in its most positive, it could be a shared concern, right? That would be a kind of beginning of a conversation around shared concerns, the future, and so in that sense, it tries to go at its most positive, right? Where it's not completely subverted. At its purest, it would be, this is our shared, air.
Yeah.
So but it's tricky, of course.
Sorry. Then again, you avoid the word sustainability. You don't use it in the book. You go for ecological performance, and I think that's deliberate, I would guess.
Yeah, well, yes. I guess certain words just become so loaded, and the other at the time when we started really the book, and the book asks the question of boundaries. Also, for example, one of the funniest comments I had, I heard about Nature City was like, well, the city's already doing this. We're asking buildings to be LEED, but that's not what it's about. First of all, the building the boundary of a building is really the wrong boundary to look at, and so I think I don't know if it was on purpose, but it's certainly sustainability has a kind of professional connotation today that was not appropriate for the way we were looking at these plans.
There was something that I found marvelously strategic. That of course I didn't knew that Corbusier and Bucky Fleur were in the draft to play for the Green Team, but apparently, they are the most recent kind of additions to the Green Team.
They are there.
Fantastic, and that is extraordinary. That we
well,
didn't
Fuller
have those
we knew.
heavy
Fuller we knew.
Yeah, he was the captain. One of the captains.
Yeah, he's still one of the captains. Corb, there were doubts. We wanted to reclaim him from the new urbanists. But I mean, it's what I was saying. At its best, this could be a kind of shared concern, right? So in some ways, it's kind of obviously more modernist than postmodernist, but it's still maybe one possibility.
Well, I think it's a nice place to kind of pull things together in a sense that if we take one of the arguments of the book to be that in order to actually make differences between all these plans, you need at some level to have some sense of commonality around which you're fighting. I think it's a very nice way to think of the comparative chart. So it's not ranking from best to worst, but it's a kind of it's a field of agonistic differences that we can then read again through the type of way that you've actually redrawn it, which I think is a terrific prompt for us. Anyway, just to have everybody join me in thanking you for...
Thank you for the invitation.